Anything except liverwurst. Back to Dotty, waiting for her sandwich at her desk. Sometimes as I walked out the door, scratching my head, wondering what to bring her, she'd call after me, "Anything except liverwurst, that is." "Thanks, Dotty. That's a little bit of help." Here's my anything except liverwurst on small talk. Anything you say is fine as long as it is not complaining, rude, or unpleasant. If the first words out of your mouth are a complaint, blam, people label you a complainer. Why? Because that complaint is your new acquaintance's 100% sampling of you so far. You could be the happiest Pollyanna ever, but how will they know? If your first comment is a complaint, you're a griper. If your first words are rude, you're a creep. If your first words are unpleasant, you're a stinker. Open and shut. Other than these downers, anything goes. Ask them where they're from, how they know the host of the party, where they bought the lovely suit they're wearing, or hundreds of et ceteras. The trick is to ask your prosaic question with passion to get the other person talking. Still feel a bit shaky on making the approach to strangers? Let's take a quick detour on our road to meaningful communicating. I'll give you 3 quickie techniques to meet people at parties, then 9 more to make small talk not so small. 12. How to make people want to start a conversation with you. Singles proficient at meeting potential sweethearts without the benefit of introduction, in the vernacular, making a pickup, have developed a deliciously devious technique that works equally well for social or corporate networking purposes. The technique requires no exceptional skill on your part, only the courage to sport a simple visual prop called a what's-it. What's a what's-it? A what's-it is anything you wear or carry that is unusual. A unique pin, an interesting purse, a strange tie, or an amusing hat. A what's-it is any object that draws people's attention and inspires them to approach you and ask, what's that? Your what's-it can be as subtle or overt as your personality and the occasion permit. I wear around my neck an outmoded pair of glasses that resembles a double monocle. Often the curious have approached me at a gathering and asked, "What's it?" I explain it's a lorgnette, left to me by my grandmother, which, of course, paves the way to discuss hatred of glasses, aging eyes, love or loss of grandmothers, adoration of antique jewelry, anywhere the inquisitor wants to take it. Perhaps unknowingly, you have fallen prey to this soon-to-be legendary technique. At a gathering, have you ever noticed someone you would like to talk to? Then you've racked your brain to conjure an excuse to make the approach. What a bounty it was to discover that he or she was wearing some weird, wild, or wonderful something you could comment on. The What's-It Way to Love. Your What's-It is a social aid whether you seek business rewards or new romance. My friend Alexander carries Greek worry beads with him wherever he goes. He's not worried. He knows any woman who wants to talk to him will come up and say, "What's that?" Think about it, gentlemen. Suppose you're at a party. An attractive woman spots you across the room. She wants to talk to you, but she's thinking, "Well, mister, you're attractive, but golly, what can I say to you? You just ain't got no what's-it." Be a what's-it seeker, too. Likewise, Become proficient in scrutinizing the apparel of those you wish to approach. Why not express interest in the handkerchief in the tycoon's vest pocket, the brooch on the bosom of the rich divorcee, or the school ring on the finger of the CEO whose company you want to work for? The big spender, who you suspect might buy 100 of your widgets, has a tiny golf club lapel pin? Say, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice your attractive lapel pin. Are you a golfer? Me too. What courses have you played?" Your business cards and your what's-it are crucial socializing artifacts. Whether you are riding in the elevator, climbing the doorstep, or traversing the path to the party, make sure your what's-it is hanging out for all to see. Technique number 12. Always wear a what's-it. Whenever you go to a gathering, wear or carry something unusual to give people who find you the delightful stranger across the crowded room an excuse to approach. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice your..." What is that? The next quickie technique was originated by doggedly determined politicians who don't let one partygoer escape if they think he or she could be helpful to their campaigns. I call it the who's that technique. 13. How to meet the people you want to meet. Say you have scrutinized the body of the important business contact you want to meet. You've searched in vain from the tip of his cowlick to the toes of his boots. He's not sporting a single what's-it. If you strike out on finding something to comment on, resort to the who's that technique. Like a persistent politician, go to the party giver and say, "That man or woman over there looks interesting. Who is he or she?" Then ask for an introduction. Don't be hesitant. The party giver will be pleased you find one of the guests interesting. If, however, you are loath to pull the party giver away from his or her other guests, you can still perform who's that. This time, don't ask for a formal introduction. Simply pump the party giver for just enough information to launch you. Find out about the stranger's jobs, interests, and hobbies. Suppose the party giver says, "Oh, that's Joe Smith. I'm not sure what his job is, but I know he loves to ski." Aha! You've just been given the icebreaker you need. Now you make a beeline for Joe Smith. "Hi, you're Joe Smith, aren't you? Susan was just telling me what a great skier you are. Where do you ski?" You get the idea. Technique number 13. Who's that? Who's that is the most effective, least used by non-politicians meeting people device ever contrived. Simply ask the party giver to make the introduction, or pump for a few facts that you can immediately turn into icebreakers. Now, the third in our little trio of meeting who you want tricks. 14. How to break into a tight crowd. The woman you've decided you must meet is wearing no what's-it? Can't find the host for the who's that technique? To make matters worse, she's deep in conversation with a group of her friends. Seems quite hopeless that you will maneuver a meeting, doesn't it? You can't just say, "Excuse me, I just thought I'd eavesdrop in and say hello." No obstacle blocks the resolute politician who always has a trick or 10 up his or her sleeve. A politico would resort to the eavesdrop-in technique. Eavesdropping, of course, conjures images of clandestine activities. Wiretapping, Watergate break-ins, or spies skulking around in the murky shadows. Eavesdropping has historical precedent with politicians, so in a pinch, it naturally comes to mind. At parties, stand near the group of people you wish to infiltrate. Then wait for a word or two you can use as a wedge to break into the group. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing that you..." and then whatever is relevant here. For example, "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion of Bermuda. I'm going there next month for the first time. Any suggestions?" Now you are in the circle and can direct your comments to your intended. Technique number 14. Eavesdrop in. No what's it? No host for who's that? No problem. Just sidle up behind the swarm of folks you want to infiltrate and open your ears. Wait for any flimsy excuse and jump in with, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear." Will they be taken aback? Momentarily. Will they get over it? Momentarily. Will you be in the conversation? Absolutely. Let us now hop back on the train that first explored Small Talk City and travel to the land of meaningful communicating. 15. How to make "Where are you from?" sound exciting. You wouldn't dream of going to a party naked. And I hope you wouldn't dream of letting your conversation be exposed naked and defenseless against the two inevitable assaults, "Where are you from?" and "What do you do?" When asked these questions, most people, like clunking a frozen steak on a china platter, drop a brick of frozen geography or baffling job title on the asker's conversational platter. Then they slap on the muzzle. You're at a convention. Everyone you meet will, of course, ask, "And where are you from?" When you give them the short-form naked city answer, "Oh, I'm from Muscatine, Iowa," or Millinocket, Maine, Winnemucca, Nevada, or anywhere they haven't heard of, what can you expect except a blank stare? Even if you're a relatively big city slicker from Denver, Colorado, Detroit, Michigan, or San Diego, California, you'll receive a panicked look from all but American history professors. They're rapidly racking their brains thinking, "What do I say next?" Even the names of world-class burgs like New York, Chicago, Washington, and Los Angeles inspire less than riveting responses. When I tell people I'm from New York City, what are they expected to say? Seen any good muggings lately? Do humanity and yourself a favor. Never ever give just a one-sentence response to the question, "Where are you from?" Give the asker some fuel for his tank, some fodder for his trough. Give the hungry communicator something to conversationally nibble on. All it takes is an extra sentence or two about your city, some interesting fact, some witty observation, to hook the asker into the conversation. Several months ago, a trade association invited me to be its keynote speaker on networking and teaching people to be better conversationalists. Just before my speech, I was introduced to Mrs. Devlin, who was the head of the association. "How do you do?" she asked. "How do you do?" I replied. Then Mrs. Devlin smiled, anxiously awaiting a sample of my stimulating conversational expertise. I asked her where she was from. She plunked a frozen Columbus, Ohio, and a big expectant grin on my platter. I had to quickly thaw her answer into digestible conversation. My mind thrashed into action. Leal's thought pattern. Gulp. Columbus, Ohio. I've never been there. Criminy, what do I know about Columbus? I know a fellow named Jeff, a successful speaker who lives there. But Columbus is too big to ask if she knows him. And besides, only kids play the do you know so-and-so game. My panicked, silent search continued. I think it's named after Christopher Columbus, but I'm not sure, so I better keep my mouth shut on that one. 4 or 5 other possibilities raced through my mind, but I rejected them all as too obvious, too adolescent, or too off the wall. I realized by now that seconds had passed, and Mrs. Devlin was still standing there with a slowly dissipating smile on her face. She was waiting for me, the expert, who within the hour was expected to teach her trade association lessons on scintillating conversation, to spew forth words of wit or wisdom. Oh, Columbus! Gee! I mumbled in desperation, watching her face fall into the worried expression of a patient being asked by the surgeon, knife poised in hand, "Where's your appendix?" I never came up with stimulating conversation on Columbus, but just then, under the knife, I created the following technique for posterity. I call it Never the Naked City. Technique number 15. Never the Naked City. Whenever someone asks you the inevitable, "And where are you from?" never ever unfairly challenge their powers of imagination with a one-word answer. Learn some engaging facts about your hometown that conversational partners can comment on. Then, when they say something clever in response to your bait, they think you're a great conversationalist. Different bait for shrimp or sharks. A fisherman uses different bait to bag bass or bluefish, and you will obviously throw out different conversational bait to snag simple shrimp or sophisticated sharks. Your hook should relate to the type of person you're speaking with. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. If someone at, say, an art gallery asked me where I was from, I might answer Washington, D.C., designed, you know, by the same city planner who designed Paris. This opens the conversational possibilities to the artistry of city planning, Paris, other cities' plans, European travel, and so forth. At a social party of singles, I'd opt for another answer. I'm from Washington, D.C., The reason I left is there were 7 women to every man when I was growing up. Now the conversation can turn to the ecstasy or agony of being single, the perceived lack of desirable men everywhere, or even flirtatious possibilities. In a political group, I'd cast a current fact from the constantly evolving political face of Washington. No need to speculate on the multitude of conversational possibilities that unlocks. Where do you get your conversational bait? Start by phoning the Chamber of Commerce or Historical Society of your town. Search the World Wide Web and click on your town, or open an old-fashioned encyclopedia. All rich sources for future stimulating conversations. Learn some history, geography, business statistics, or perhaps a few fun facts to tickle future friends' funny bones. The Devlin debacle inspired further research. The minute I got home, I called the Columbus Chamber of Commerce and the Historical Society. Say you too are from Columbus, Ohio, and your new acquaintance lays it on you. Where are you from? When you are talking with a business person, your answer could be, I'm from Columbus, Ohio. You know, many major corporations do their product testing in Columbus because it's so commercially typical. In fact, it's been called the most American city in America. They say if it booms or bombs in Columbus, it booms or bombs nationally. Talking with someone with a German last name, tell her about Columbus's historic German village with the brick streets and the wonderful 1850s-style little houses. It's bound to inspire stories of the old country. Your conversation partner's surname is Italian. Tell him Genoa, Italy is Columbus's sister city. Talking with an American history buff, tell him that Columbus was indeed named after Christopher Columbus, and that a replica of the Santa Maria is anchored in the Scioto River. Talking with a student, tell her about the 5 universities in Columbus. The possibilities continue. You suspect your conversation partner has an artistic bent? Ah, you throw out casually. Columbus is the home of artist George Bellows. Columbusites, prepare some tasty snacks for askers, even if you know nothing about them. Here's a goodie. Tell them you always have to say Columbus, Ohio, because there is also a Columbus, Arkansas, Columbus, Georgia, Columbus, Indiana, Columbus, Kansas, Columbus, Kentucky, Columbus, Mississippi, Columbus, Montana, Columbus, Nebraska, Columbus, New Jersey, Columbus, New Mexico, Columbus, North Carolina, Columbus, North Dakota, Columbus, Pennsylvania, Columbus, Texas, and Columbus, Wisconsin. That spreads the conversational possibilities to 15 other states. Remember, as a quotable notable once said, no man would listen to you talk if he didn't know it was his turn next. A postscript to the hellish experience I had with Columbus. Months later, I mentioned the trauma to my speaker friend from Columbus, Jeff. Jeff explained his house was really in a smaller town just minutes outside Columbus. What town, Jeff? Gehenna, Ohio. Gehenna means hell in Hebrew, he said, and then went on to explain why he thought ancient Hebrew historians were clairvoyant. Thanks, Jeff. I knew you'd never lay a naked city on any of your listeners. 16. How to come out a winner every time they ask, and what do you do? Third only to death and taxes is the assurance a new acquaintance will soon chirp, and what do you do? Is it fitting and proper they should make that query? We'll pick up that sticky wicket later. For the moment, these few defensive moves help you keep your crackerjack communicator credentials when asked the inevitable question. First, like Never the Naked City, don't toss a short shrift answer in response to the asker's breathless inquiry. You leave the poor fish flopping on the deck when you just say your title. I'm an actuary, an auditor, an author, an astrophysicist. Have mercy so he or she doesn't feel like a nincompoop outsider asking, what kind of actualizing, auditing, authoring, or astrophysicizing do you do? You're an attorney. Don't leave it to laymen to try to figure out what you really do. Flesh it out. Tell a little story your conversation partner can get a handle on. For example, if you're talking with a young mother, say, I'm an attorney. Our firm specializes in employment law. In fact, Now I'm involved in a case where a company actually discharged a woman for taking extra maternity leave that was a medical necessity. A mother can relate to that. Talking with a business owner, say, "I'm an attorney. Our firm specializes in employment law. My current case concerns an employer who is being sued by one of her staff for asking personal questions during the initial job interview." A business owner can relate to that. Technique number 16. Never the naked job. When asked the inevitable, "And what do you do?" you may think, "I'm an economist, an educator, an engineer," is giving enough information to engender good conversation. However, to one who is not an economist, educator, or an engineer, you might as well be saying, "I'm a paleontologist, psychoanalyst, pornographer." Flesh it out. Throw out some delicious facts about your job for new acquaintances to munch on. Otherwise, they'll soon excuse themselves, preferring the snacks back at the cheese tray. Painful memories of naked job flashers. I still harbor painful recollections of being tongue-tied when confronted by naked job flashers. Like the time a fellow at a dinner party told me, "I'm a nuclear scientist." My weak, "Oh, that must be fascinating," reduced me to a mental molecule in his eyes. The chap on my other side announced, "I'm in industrial abrasives," and then paused, waiting for me to be impressed. My, "Golly, you must have to be a shrewd judge of character to be in industrial abrasives," didn't fly either. We three sat in silence the rest of the meal. Just last month, a new acquaintance bragged, "I'm planning to teach Tibetan Buddhism at Truckee Meadows Community College," and then clammed up. I knew less about Truckee Meadows than I did about Tibetan Buddhism. Whenever people ask you what you do, give them some mouth-to-ear resuscitation so they can catch their breath and say something. 17. How to introduce people like the hostess with the mostest. It is important to help newly-mets through their first nervous moments. "Susan, I'd like you to meet John Smith. John, this is Susan Jones." Duh, what do you expect John and Susan to say? "Smith? That's Smith, isn't it?" Golly, Susan, well now that's an interesting name." Nice try, forget it. Don't blame John or Susan for being less than scintillating. The fault lies with the person who introduced the two the way most people introduce their friends to each other, with naked names. They cast out a line with no bait for people to sink their teeth into. Big winners may not talk a lot, but conversation never dies unwillingly in their midst. They make sure of it with techniques like never the naked introduction. When they introduce people, they buy an insurance policy on the conversation with a few simple add-ons. "Susan, I'd like you to meet John. John has a wonderful boat we took a trip on last summer. John, this is Susan Smith. Susan is editor-in-chief of Shoestring Gourmet magazine." Padding the introduction gives Susan the opportunity to ask what kind of boat John has or where the group went. It gives John an opening to discuss his love of writing, or of cooking, or of food. The conversation can then naturally expand to travel in general, life on boats, past vacations, favorite recipes, restaurants, budgets, diets, magazines, editorial policy, to infinity. If you're not comfortable mentioning someone's job during the introduction, mention their hobby or even a talent. The other day at a gathering, the hostess introduced a man named Gilbert. She said, "Leal, I'd like you to meet Gilbert. Gilbert's gift is sculpting. He makes beautiful wax carvings." I remember thinking, gift. Now that's a lovely way to introduce someone and induce conversation. Technique number 17. Never the naked introduction. When introducing people, don't throw out an unbaited hook and stand there grinning like a big clam, leaving the newly-mets to flutter their fins and fish for a topic. Bait the conversational hook to get them in the swim of things. Then you're free to stay or float on to the next networking opportunity. Armed with these 2 personality enhancers, 3 conversation igniters, and 3 small extenders, it is time to take a step up the communications ladder. Let us now rise from small talk and seek the path to more meaningful dialogue. The next technique is guaranteed to make the exchange engrossing for your conversation partner. 18. How to resuscitate a dying conversation. Even a well-intentioned husband who might ask his wife while making love, "Is it good for you too, honey?" knows not to ask a colleague, "Is the conversation good for you too?" Yet he wonders. We all do. With the following technique, set your mind at rest. You can definitely make the conversation hot for anyone with whom you speak. Like my prom date Donnie, you will miraculously find subjects to engross your listeners. Be a sleuth on their slips of the tongue. No matter how elusive the clue, Sherlock Holmes is confident he'll soon be staring right at it through his magnifying glass. Like the unerring detective, big winners know, no matter how elusive the clue, they'll find the right topic. How? They become word detectives. I have a young friend, Nancy, who works in a nursing home. Nancy cares deeply about the elderly, but often grumbles about how crotchety and laconic some of her patients are. She laments she has difficulty relating to them. Nancy told me about one especially cantankerous old woman named Mrs. Otis, whom she could never get to open up to her. One day, Nancy confided, right after all those rainstorms we had last week, just to make conversation, I remarked to Mrs. Otis, "Terrible storms we had last week, don't you think?" "Well," Nancy continued, Mrs. Otis practically jumped down my throat. She said in a snippy voice, "It's been good for the plants." I asked Nancy how she responded to that. "What could I say?" Nancy answered. "The woman was obviously cutting me off." "Did you ever think to ask Mrs. Otis if she liked plants?" "Plants?" Nancy asked. "Well, yes," I suggested. Mrs. Otis brought the subject up. I asked Nancy to do me a favor. "Ask her," I begged. Nancy resisted, but I persisted. Just to quiet me down, Nancy promised to ask cantankerous old Mrs. Otis if she liked plants. The next day, a flabbergasted Nancy called me from work. "Leal, how did you know?" Not only did Mrs. Otis love plants, but she told me she'd been married to a gardener. Today I had a different problem with Mrs. Otis. I couldn't shut her up. She went on and on about her garden, her husband. Top communicators know ideas don't come out of nowhere. If Mrs. Otis thought to bring up plants, then she must have some relationship with them. Furthermore, by mentioning the word, it meant subconsciously she wanted to talk about plants. Suppose, for example, instead of responding to Nancy's comment about the rain with, "It's good for the plants," Mrs. Otis had said, "Because of the rain, my dog couldn't go out." Nancy could then ask about her dog. Or suppose she grumbled, "It's bad for my arthritis." Can you guess what old Mrs. Otis wants to talk about now? When talking with anyone, keep your ears open and, like a good detective, listen for clues. Be on the lookout for any unusual references, any anomaly, deviation, digression, or invocation of another place, time, person. Ask about it because it's the clue to what your conversation partner would really enjoy discussing. If two people have something in common, when the shared interest comes up, they jump on it naturally. For example, if someone mentions playing squash, bird watching, or stamp collecting, and the listener shares that passion, he or she pipes up, "Oh, you're a squasher, or birder, or philatelist, too." Here's the trick. There's no need to be a squasher, birder, or philatelist to pipe up with enthusiasm. You can simply be a word detective. When you pick up on the reference as though it excites you too, it parlays you into conversation the stranger thrills to. The subject may put your feet to sleep, but that's another story. Technique number 18. Be a word detective. Like a good gumshoe, listen to your conversation partner's every word for clues to his or her preferred topic. The evidence is bound to slip out. Then spring on that subject like a sleuth onto a slip of the tongue. Like Sherlock Holmes, you have the clue to the subject that's hot for the other person. Now that you've ignited stimulating conversation, let's explore a technique to keep it hot. 19. How to enthrall 'em with your choice of topic, them. Several years ago, a girlfriend and I attended a party saturated with a hodgepodge of swelligant folks. Everyone we talked to seemed to lead a nifty life. Discussing the party afterward, I asked my friend, "Diane, of all the exciting people at the party, who did you enjoy talking to most?" Without hesitation, she said, "Oh, by far, Dan Smith." "What does Dan do?" I asked her. Well, I'm not sure," she answered. "Where does he live?" I don't know," Diane responded. "Well, what is he interested in?" "Well, we really didn't talk about his interests." "Diane," I asked, "what did you talk about?" "Well, I guess we talked mostly about me." Aha, I thought. Diane has just rubbed noses with a winner. As it turns out, I had the pleasure of meeting Big Winner Dan several months later. Diane's ignorance about his life piqued my curiosity, so I grilled him for details. As it turns out, Dan lives in Paris, has a beach home in the south of France, and a mountain home in the Alps. He travels around the world producing sound and light shows for pyramids and ancient ruins. And he is an avid hang glider and scuba diver. Does this man have an interesting life or what? Yet Dan, when meeting Diane, said nothing about himself. I told Dan about how pleased Diane was to meet him, yet how little she learned about his life. Dan simply replied, "Well, when I meet someone, I learn so much more if I ask about their life. I always try to turn the spotlight on the other person." Truly confident people often do this. They know they grow more by listening than talking. Obviously, they also captivate the talker. Sell yourself with a top sales technique. Several months ago at a speakers convention, I was talking with a colleague, Brian Tracy. Brian does a brilliant job of training top salespeople. He tells his students of a giant spotlight that, when shining on their product, is not as interesting to the prospect. When they shine the spotlight on the prospect, they make the sale. Salespeople, this technique is especially crucial for you. Keep your swiveling spotlight aimed away from you, only lightly on your product, and most brightly on your buyer. You'll do a much better job of selling yourself and your product. Technique number 19. The swiveling spotlight. When you meet someone, imagine a giant revolving spotlight between you. When you're talking, the spotlight is on you. When the new person is speaking, it's shining on him or her. If you shine it brightly enough, the stranger will be blinded to the fact that you have hardly said a word about yourself. The longer you keep it shining away from you, the more interesting he or she finds you. 20. How to never need to wonder, what do I say next? Moments arise, of course, when even conversationalists extraordinaire hit the wall. Some folks' monosyllabic grunts leave slim pickings even for masters of the be-a-word detective technique. If you find yourself futilely fanning the embers of a dying conversation, and if you feel, for political reasons or human compassion, that the conversation should continue, here's a foolproof trick to get the fire blazing again. I call it parroting, after that beautiful tropical bird that captures everyone's heart simply by repeating other people's words. Have you ever, puttering around the house, had the TV in the background tuned to a tennis game? You hear the ball going back and forth over the net. Clink, clunk, clink, clunk, clink. This time you don't hear the clunk. The ball didn't hit the court. What happened? You immediately look up at the set. Likewise, in conversation, the conversational ball goes back and forth. First you speak, then your partner speaks, you speak, and so it goes back and forth. Each time through a series of nods and comforting grunts like, mm-hmm, or, you let your conversation partner know the ball has landed in your court. It's your I got it signal. Such is the rhythm of conversation. What do I say next? Back to that frightfully familiar moment when it is your turn to speak but your mind goes blank. Don't panic. Instead of signaling verbally or non-verbally that you got it, simply repeat or parrot the last 2 or 3 words your companion said in a sympathetic, questioning tone. That throws the conversational ball right back in your partner's court. My friend Phil sometimes picks me up at the airport. Usually I am so exhausted that I rudely fall asleep in the passenger seat, relegating Phil to nothing more than a chauffeur. After one especially exhausting trip some years ago, I flung my bags in his trunk and flopped onto the front seat. As I was dozing off, he mentioned he'd gone to the theater the night before. Usually, I would have just grunted and wafted into unconsciousness. However, on this particular trip, I had learned the parroting technique and was eager to try it. "Theater?" I parroted quizzically. "Yes, it was a great show," he replied, fully expecting it to be the last word on the subject before I fell into my usual sleepy stupor. "Great show?" I parroted. Pleasantly surprised by my interest, he said, "Yes, it's a new show by Stephen Sondheim called Sweeney Todd." "Sweeney Todd?" I again parroted. Now Phil was getting fired up. "Yeah, great music and an unbelievably bizarre story." "Bizarre story?" I parroted. Well, that's all Phil needed. For the next half an hour, Phil told me the show's story about a London barber who went around murdering people. I half dozed, but soon decided his tale of Sweeney Todd's cutting off people's heads was disturbing my sleepy reverie. So I simply backed up and parroted one of his previous phrases to get him on another track. "You said it had great music?" That did the trick. For the rest of the 45-minute trip to my home, Phil sang me Pretty Women, The Best Pies in London, and other songs from Sweeney Todd. Much better accompaniment for my demi-nap. I'm sure to this day Phil thinks of that trip as one of the best conversations we ever had. And all I did was parrot a few of his phrases.